Hello there. Welcome to Pinarai Kairi podcast / videocast. My name is Vinaya Raghavan. I am from a village called Pinarai back in Kerala. Hence the name of the show, Pinarai Kairi, which means a girl from Pinarai. At the moment, I live in a tiny village called Edenbridge in England. I believe life is about people and relationships. Conversations with people and hearing their life stories can help us all gain a broader perspective. Through these videos, I hope to bring the stories of people who inspired me. Today's guest is my good friend and a firebrand comrade, Madhavi Jha. I met Madhavi when she was in London as part of her research on women labourers who were part of famine works in colonial North India. So, let's begin. Thank you, Madhavi, for joining the show.
Thank you for calling me on the show.
No worries. So, I think it is better that I don't introduce you. I know you as a friend, but who is Madhavi in your own words?
All right. So I am Madhavi, and I have just finished my PhD from Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, which has been in news quite a lot recently. But it is also a very good place to do history. And I've done a PhD in history, and I submitted it last year. And I am awaiting. So I'm basically an unemployed history graduate, and who's interested in politics and gender and class and caste and labor, and is very happy to be here. Oh, and also, though I've finished after finishing my PhD, I shifted to Hyderabad. So right now I'm speaking to you from Hyderabad, which is a state in Telangana in India.
Yeah. And you are a very staunch feminist. I remember the heated discussions we used to have where you passionately used to speak about
yes, gender. And so yeah, my PhD topic is also on women. So it's on women laborers in India, and specifically from 1860s to 1900 in the construction work. I can speak more about it later.
So that is a sort of a topic that we don't learn about or hear about, or even literature. I haven't read anything in that realm, It is something a very closed thing for me. I don't know whether there must be some. Are there like enough literature on that topic in?
So yeah, the reason why I chose this topic was also because this is not worked upon a lot, either in history or in other subjects as well. They don't very often also form part of, say, popular culture. So they are not. You won't find a lot of central characters in movies or even big novels, the classics. Where the woman is a construction laborer. So yeah, I mean, it's no surprise that you haven't encountered the history or literature or anything else of women laborers so much in India. Even in the field of labor history, which is where I kind of locate my work, women's work is kind of marginalized, and because mostly most people who do labor history are very much interested in laborers in the factories and mills and mines and so on. So there's a whole reason of historiography for that. So there are two reasons. One is, of course, because there has been this there's this understanding of history that that workers develop a workers' consciousness within factories and these kinds of organized sites of labor, and then of course they become politically conscious, and then they will overthrow the capitalist system, so on or whatever, even organize and so on. So that's the kind of a Marxist orthodoxy that has for long ruled historiography in India and the world. So what has happened in the case of India is that hence the histories of labor have usually focused on men who are working in these, in these sites. But the truth is that India is actually even today 50% based on agriculture, and most people labor, so as to say, in agriculture and in rural based occupations, and a lot of them are women. Also, yeah. So coming to my specific area, so I was actually looking to, when I started my work, I was actually looking to work on women in agriculture, because that's something that has been missed out in Indian historiography. But there are, of course, there are exceptions to this. There is someone, a really good historian called Samita Sen. She's at Cambridge right now. So she's worked on women in jute mills of Calcutta, of Bengal, sorry. So I wanted to work on agriculture, and I wanted to see what is happening in agriculture to women, especially in 1860s to 1900s and so on. But when I looked at the archives, so we come to the second reason why women and others have been sort of marginalized in history. It's also because to write history, to write credible history, you require sources and you require proof, and which comes to us in different forms. But mostly, a lot of historians at least depend dominantly on government archival sources, right? And of course, there are also songs and literature and so on. But to write a really full history of people, you need a variety of sources. And most of the histories that have been written of this period, especially, not so much early, but this period especially, have relied on government sources, or what is called British archives, so which is located, like a lot of it is also located in the National Library and so on, where I used to visit the archives and so on. I remember I spent
so much time
over there.
You used to start at 8 o'clock.
I know. 8 o'clock to 7 o'clock. Yeah. So of course, I mean, a lot of these people, including women, a lot of these figures are missing in these archives, because they are not, they don't, it doesn't make any sense to sort of, it didn't make any sense for the girl to archive them or to make documents or produce any documents around them. So I didn't find a lot on agriculture, but what I found was that from 1860 onwards, there were a series of famines in India, in large parts of India, which included both the northern and southern India, from 1860s to 1907, 1908. And at least from late 1870s, the colonial government, the British government, British Indian government, had what was called the Famine Relief Program. And one of the ways in which this program gave relief was a sort of a work for wages, work for relief. So you would go and you would work in a construction site, and you would get a minimum wage. This wage was really little. It was what is sometimes called starvation wage, which is what that they had somehow calculated the minimum amount that is needed for someone to survive, and they used to give that. And so by 1898, they did an overview, and it was found that 50% of people who were working on these relief works were women nationally. So I was like very happy, because that meant that there will be documentation on them, because they were part of this relief program. And that's how I decided to work on this topic, because I had a lot of documentation, because these are very well documented. These famines were well documented. So these, yeah. So I was
You were saying these archives are really good.
So these archives are good, and they're from official to semi-official to non-official, because these famines from 1860s to 1908 became a huge embarrassment for the British Empire, and they had to sort of give a justification of why they were ruling India if people were dying in famines and so on. So a lot of eyes were on these famines. one historian estimates that the people who died in these years is somewhere from 12 million to 30 million. I'm not sure. So there were huge casualties also. So yeah, so then so I have basically then used these records to write a history of what was happening on these construction sites, which were basically sites of railways, roads, tanks, embankments, mainly wells, canals. So these were public works. Also, it also provided the British Indian government an easy source, an easy supply, and a cheap supply of labor to finish this work. Yeah.
So because it was under the colonial rule and everything was so draconian, I think there might not have been any unionizing of that. No, it was just people were, working to live and then go back to work again just to survive.
No, contrary to that, I mean that is one of the major findings of my research. Is that it's true that the kind of organized labor movement started in 1920s in India. The first meeting, so there are two meetings. The first meeting was in Tashkent, and the other meeting, the 1925, the meeting of which CPI, the Communist Party of India, was born, was in Kanpur in 1925. So, and very much under the influence of the Comintern and the Soviet Russia. And the present party, the CPM, CPI, Communist Party of India, Marxist and Communist Party of India, does draw its legacy from the 1925 sort of meetings and what happened after that. And it's a very rich history indeed. But before the official labor parties, there is a rich history of laborers' protests and strikes. And right from 1880s, when you had the jute, by 1880s, the British in British India, there had been some centers of industrial agglomerations, which included the jute factories and textile, very importantly, textile factories in Bombay, Kanpur. You had the jute mills in Calcutta. You also in Chennai. There were labor unions also, not the communist ones, but there were labor unions, and there were and not just labor unions. There were also workers who had developed a consciousness of their own, unlike under a party, which we would not strictly call. So there's a lot of debate on whether it's the whole vanguard versus non-vanguard kind of debate. But laborers, of course, also have been for a long time combining, if not unionizing, combining to ask for their rights, which usually are also about wages and time, but also about caste indignities, in India, very, very prominently about caste indignities, and which are kind of enmeshed typically in India with the labor that you provide. Or that you are engaged in. And so, I mean, historians have kind of now questioned this divide between, a labor consciousness that is developed under a professional party and a labor consciousness that exists in different modes. So one major finding of my research is that these women, is that usually there is this understanding that women in a construction site, even if you go today, not in England, but in India, if you go to a construction site in India, it looks very much like it would have looked in 1860s, even down to the tools that they're using.
The conditions as well.
The conditions as well. So they have, so you'll see that the men are mostly digging earth, and women are carrying it in a, in a basket and taking it to a certain distance. So there's this whole division of labor that is apparent, which is that men are diggers and women are carriers, and digger wages are a little higher than the carrier wages. So I wanted to investigate whether this is this division of labor, where does it come from? Because on the face of it, one would imagine that this comes from the idea that men are stronger and that men can do the more hard work. But let me tell you, it's very difficult to also carry that. but still, I mean, that is the idea. So I wanted to investigate whether this was the reigning gender ideology that also existed at that time. And what I found was that, of course, the British had a certain idea of men's and women's capacities to work, and it was sort of codified in the wages that were given. But I came across a set of archives and inspection notes from Uttar Pradesh. At that time, it was called Northwestern Provinces, in Allahabad district. And what I found was very interesting sort of opposition by women themselves to any kind of sexual division of labor. Not because they didn't think that men were either stronger or not stronger, because that question was immaterial to a large extent. But what was material to them was the wages. And in a series of sort of modification of this men digger and women carrier, we see that because women were in high numbers in these camps and these sites of work, they managed to sort of get the wages that they wanted for the work that they wanted to do. Which was a revelation to me, because usually you do not find evidence of, instinctively that women, of course, women are not these, bichari mahilas who are just, letting all atrocities happen on them. That's far from truth. That's what we know of women. And we know that patriarchy and gender ideologies are really, really strong in the way that they affect communities, and they have an effect on class, caste, everything. But also that women themselves negotiate with these ideologies to better their wages and to better their conditions of work. So that's what I found, and this is from 1905. So this data, so it was very exciting to find this, and that's why I wrote it in a paper. So yeah.
It's
women
interesting
were pretty much active. Yeah.
It's interesting that time itself, there was a voice, for women, and and I always feel that left is always winning slowly, but still winning. I mean, we're losing elections and all, but if you look at the progress and the state of women, and what women can do, and I'm sure we're not there yet, but in for Dalits in India and all, I think we're far from anywhere where justice has been done. But still, I feel like left is slowly winning in the grand scheme of world stuff.
Yeah. I'm an optimist. I think you have to be an optimist to be a communist or a socialist or anything. Because if you're not an optimist, you will just want to die.
True.
But yeah, I always find like that. I always tell it like when I talk to especially girls or my cousins or friends, that I know that it's really tough, but it's also the best time to be a woman in India. Like you have access to education like never before, and the cultural norms are changing, and whatever government comes, it will be very difficult to reverse certain changes that have happened. And I don't think we are on the way forward, and especially with gender, and especially in India. I mean, come on, like even 20 years ago, things were not the same.
Mm.
I think in my lifetime only I've seen cultural attitudes change, and just I think education is such a big deal.
Mm.
And
Correct.
also so just the fact that, like you said, Dalits, or even like so we do hear of so many atrocities and so on, but that's also a backlash to the fact that Dalits are today, they are doing so well, and they are able to, if given a
Marching
chance.
forward.
Yeah,
Mm.
they're marching forward, and they are going to take your all the privileges that you have, surely. And that is of course fueling this fear. I think it's a fear as well as
I
the
know.
fear of
Yeah.
losing power. True.
Yeah.
I think in India also the problem is that that, people don't even understand this, for like understand the positions they take vis-a-vis women, and especially Dalits. Like you'll find so many anti-reservation policy people, but if you like have a conversation with them, after like just they have, first of all, there's so much ignorance around the reality of India. Like people, especially middle class, you spoke about the middle class, and it's become so apparent in this pandemic that middle class really doesn't know India. They don't know that we have, like, most of our workforce is working in the unorganized sector, and that a lot of them will have to march back to their homes if they are not paid. So I think it's also sort of that middle class, and I wouldn't say it's some sort of it's a willing ignorance.
Yeah. It's not any malice or anything, but I think it is just that they're not aware of what the real India is, and what the essential workers are actually made up of. Most of these unorganized daily wages laborers, actually. Yeah.
And also like it's so much willingness there is, but I am also amazed at how much are they willing to be ignorant, as in even when so much has happened, and it's obvious that people are suffering, and at least in North India, there's sort of maliciousness which is coming from history, ignorance of history, and ignorance of economics, and all sorts of ignorance. And also, like in the last 20 years, the individual consumption has also become a way of life, and your identity is tied to sort of this consumption. And I'm afraid to call it like American consumption, but yeah, just consumption. I
It's
mean,
a capitalist
maybe typified. Yes.
consumerism.
Yeah, maybe
Consequences.
typified in American consumerism, but somehow like it's scary the way consumerism has become a stand-in. Like you are what you consume, and I think that has also gone quite a distance to sort of benumb people to what's happening to others.
So do you remember like your earliest memory, your interest in history? Where did it come from? From whom did it come from? Or was it just a self interest?
No, so I don't remember the earliest memory of history as such, but my grandfather, he's a poet. He was a poet. We lost him last year. So he had started poetry quite late in life after he was retired. My maternal grandfather. And
it was the Maithili language.
Yes.
Yeah, the book I have from you.
Oh, you have the book. Yes. So he wrote 4 books, and he was very productive, even though it was late. But he had, even before he started writing, he was very interested in literature. And so whenever we used to visit him, definitely my first interest towards reading, which in itself is important, came from him. Also because then he would not just give you a book, he would also tell you the importance of that particular book, the context and so on, and why it was so very important for you to read that particular book. And he knew Hindi, English, and Urdu, and of course Maithili, which is our mother tongue. But he would collect. He was a collector of poems and literature, and in every possible language. And he had translations. And he used to live in Ranchi, so by the end of his sort of poetry, like poem writing life, he also started writing in hybrid languages of, something called Santali Maithili. Now, Santali is a language of the Chota Nagpur area, and Maithili is, of course, from North Bihar. But people had come here and they were speaking. So these hybrid languages, which are languages of migrants mainly, and also something called Julaha Maithili, which is a Maithili that is spoken by weavers. So he would also, and he was a humanist. He had a very rich collection of books, and he would always encourage us to read and also to discuss and also locate it in its proper context. And world literature, he got us interested in world literature, which was very good because, then that sort of gives you that expanse. So that sort of, I would say, broadened my mind in a very, I think that's a prerequisite to whatever you might do later, but that's a prerequisite. It sort of enables you, at least for some time in the day, to rise above the immediate, which is so important especially for women in India, because you are so sort of, patriarchy is also kind of weaves you inside this immediate thing,
Rule book.
Rule book. And also, like, what is more important is how you look, how you dress, what did, the politics of what's happening in the house, and what to cook and what not to cook, and so on. So
even now, I have this self-doubt sometimes. Like, I spend a day reading or, just lazing about it, and I feel like, oh God, I haven't done any housework. And then I have to tell myself, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Even now.
I know, the tyranny of housework. My biggest fear, I know, my biggest fear as a teenager was that I'll get married and then I'll have to spend all my time in the kitchen. I don't know why. I mean, it is an irrational fear, because my parents were not at all like that. They were very much interested in my education and me getting a good career and so on. And they had big dreams for me. But I think it's just the environment around you, which sort of beats that gender role into you. Yeah. Women around you. I mean, it's not easy. I always look at career women who have also, I mean, now that I am in that position somewhat, I would say now I'm in that position, because now that I've like sort of settled into a household, I can see that it can be a real struggle between, whether because it takes time to do something even in the house, and you can't live in an absolute pigsty, and that it has to be there has to be a balance, and there has to be a give and take, and you have to make some sacrifices, and then but anyway, so so that was very influential. But I was interested in till my 10th class. Like I said, you have to sort of choose after 10th whether you would go for science or arts. Arts, as it is called, humanities and arts. So I was interested in two subjects, physics and history. And I actually, at some point, I think I was more interested in physics than history, but I was really bad at math. And everybody told me that you can't do physics if you're bad at math. I must thank my teacher at that time, Mrs. Anita Rana. Miss Anita Rana. And she was an absolutely fantastic teacher. And I think if you ask like 100 people, 90 of them will tell you that they chose their subject because their high school teacher was very good. But I'm not exaggerating when I say she was really, really good. To the extent that a lot of people who scored really good marks by the end of our class, like in class 12, went on to take history. So she was very influential. And also, like, her classrooms were really interesting. She would teach history in a very conversational manner. She would get you interested. Also, and now she's a headmistress in a very, very good school in Noida, in Delhi. So she was very influential. And then, of course, I went to a very good college. So because it had an amazing faculty, and in DU, Delhi University, and they were all very, very they all had a certain commitment to making history interesting.
Mm.
So I think it was a combination of my own interest and really, I was lucky to have a really good set of teachers and who were all committed to the subject. So that's how but if you were to ask me what I really liked about it, like if I were to pinpoint at that time, I really like the first thing when we entered the first class, I remember in my college. I don't know if it's said in other other subjects, but the moment we entered the graduation in history, you were like, forget what you think about religion, forget what you think about gender, forget what you think about India, like India in quotes. Everything has to be unlearned. And, so that was really interesting. At, 18, you're already raring to go and you're like, oh my God, so there is a world out there and then there is this world that you need to relearn or unlearn. So it was very exciting. And also what I really like about history is the process part. So history really tells you what happened, how. So there's always like, it starts with something and then there is that unspooling of things and processes, and it sort of then goes back to everything coming together in a certain way. So like temporally, something is X and then it becomes Y, but there's a little bit of X in it also. So the process of this change, it's very interesting because then it's like, maybe it's like physics, like you have to go in and see how it's sort of working out and what are the forces, So that was very interesting.
It's something I hear a lot as well right now in UK as well, because people are not taught about the slavery, the atrocities of slavery of the British Empire, and even in American history as well. But here there's like a big discourse going on now where people are saying that the colonial history as well. Like nobody knew about Bengal famine or anything. Most of the people, they were like surprised about that because it's such a huge thing, but it's not something that has ever come across as an atrocity. I mean, we hear about Holocaust a lot, no? Because it's taught and there's loads of literature about it, and it is in the mainstream as well. A lot of discussions, but
yeah, true. I mean, and also, one has to also see that there is a whole establishment committed to sort of push a certain version of history. There have also been empire apologists who have said that, look, boss, we ruled you, but you gave you X, Y, Z. And that's a very strong sort of block within the academia in England. And nobody wants to hear a bad thing about their own past. so I think they also sort of, and I think under the conservative government in, I think, Margaret Thatcher time, there was also this whole push to write more conservative history.
A lot of times people come towards centrist position because of this this thing where people are always telling you like there's something really wrong that you like communism, or especially in Europe, if you say you're a communist, it's like such a big it's like saying you're a Nazi or something, where people think that you're such an evil person, you have believed in all the gulags and all those things. So that is just so because of that social image thing, people move towards the center. I feel that is what I feel like. Most of the people want left ideologies and they want more nationalized trains and all that here. But when they talk about their ideology, they're like, oh no, I'm not far left, I'm actually in the middle.
So I think it's also kind of hypocritical. Like these are very culturally derived notions of what Marxism or communism is. And whereas, like at least in India, we've had a very good run as a communist, because so Kerala is practically Europe in terms of human development standards and so on. Nothing has been done in Kerala or these states that is even 1/10 of what's happening now. So if you're telling me now that communists are worse, then I don't know. And also, I think even for people in Europe and America and so on, there's also a lot of ideological sort of war that has gone on in make painting communists like that.
Yeah, they've successfully done it, I feel,
Yeah.
in the Cold War era. They've had, people have really difficulty in hearing that word.
Yeah, at least in India, I'm very ready to say it now because I'm very, very happy to say that fine. Yeah, I believe that all of us should have an equal chance. And why should your child go to these good schools and eat such nice food? And her only worry is that she doesn't have one little thing of which she has hundreds already. And why should a laborer's child, a migrant's child be dying on her way to home? I think just the two images are so contradictory that I feel no moral qualms in saying that your child and that child needs to have the same life, and any ideology that unequivocally supports that has my vote and has my commitment. Because it's more clear now than anywhere, that anytime in England, in India, in USA, at least these countries, that the rich are going to look after themselves, even in a pandemic, and they're just going to let the poor die. Black Americans have been dying in higher numbers, even where they are not a larger part of the. Yeah.
Here also, actually, BAME people have died more, brown and black.
Yeah. And in India, people have just died on their way to home from home. There's reason to be absolutely optimistic. And look at Black lives everywhere, actually, everywhere. In the US, in UK. There are so many more young people who are on the side of justice and equality and
True.
So then work needs to be done there. And I think that's amazing. And it's so easy to sort of talk across these, geographical and all sorts of boundaries. Like I completely understand understand the emotion behind the people who've been talking in the Black Lives Movement, or who've been talking even before this from the Bernie Sanders or Jeremy Corbyn sort of camp, and they hopefully understand what we say when we talk in JNU. So that's the dream.
Yeah, I always think that the Labour Party here as well should also be like it's a global movement, the Labour movement, whereas it's not, it is regional as well, but the whole solidarity should be like, you are standing for the working class of the world. Yeah, workers of the world.
So I think, that's the Marxist quote one must always remember. It's the workers of the world unite. Because capitalists is united at the level of global level, global capitalism. So workers of the world have to unite.
Indeed.
Yeah. Amazing tradition to look back to and learn from, like indigenous traditions of, communist strikes and upheavals. Telangana, where I'm sitting right now, it's amazing. It's one of the earliest and the largest guerrilla warfare communist movement, the Telangana movement. And which sort of spanned pre and post independence. So, started in 46, ended in 51. And there's so much. And they were able to achieve a lot. And it had a huge influence in the, in the people here, in the minds of people in Telangana.
I think we talked about all the things that because history in our curriculum, women laborers of India, labor movement, books and people around you. I think we spoke about all those things.
You'd ask me also about books and so on. Yeah, but so that's the thing. Like I got this reading habit as a child. But if you were to ask me like a favorite book, I won't be able to tell you because I used to read a lot. But also like those books sort of somehow became part of learning in a very organic way. So I don't have like a favorite book, but and now I'm not reading that much during my PhD because I'm not reading like outside my research topic. Now I've gotten back to it, but I think like if like some books just became a part of the ongoing experience. So something that came to my mind when I was thinking about this was that so when the whole Gujarat riots were happening, 2002, and we were all so there was this intense debate on Hindu, Muslim, Islam, and you were also learning about Hinduism and Islam and so on in history classes. And then I read a short story by Manto. Saadat Hasan Manto is a very famous Urdu writer, and he's written a very short story. He's written a very nice. So I used to read his books at that point in time, and it just seamlessly sort of got connected to whatever was happening. And I remember reading this short novel. It's called Khol Do in Hindi, and in Hindi/Urdu, but Open It in English translation, which is what I read. I read the English translation. And recently I went back to the Hindi translation. And it had such an impact on me, and because of everything around me, but also because, I would highly recommend it to anyone who wants to read it. It's shocking. Like, you will be shocked for like a good 2-3 hours. It's a short story. It's like this long. But it's just so shocking. Like, even as I'm talking, my hands on my head, the hair on my hand is raised. It has, so that kind of an experience that a book can give you is something to relish. And I think it's very important in sort of opening your mind. So recently I've been reading Elena Ferrante's books, very famous, right? The one set in Italy. And again, they sort of absorb you. But also the thing is that, and again, one thing that I've read, which I was, when I was reading about caste and I was reading Ambedkar and all, and one book that was very, very important in our childhood, like not childhood, adulthood, was Arundhati Roy's God of Small Things, because it had won the Booker Prize. She was, I think, the first person or the second person. I don't know. Salman Rushdie was the first. I don't remember. But something very phenomenal had happened in literature. And the book I read, one had to, like, if you were in a certain class, caste background, and you were interested and you were going to an English medium college or school, you would end up reading this book. So just like you would end up reading Salman Rushdie's book, I suppose. So yeah, and that really showed caste in such a startling way in a state that all of us think of as very, very progressive, and which is indeed very progressive when in a comparative sort of framework. So I think all those, but also like I also read like biographies. So there's a biography by Ajoy Bose, who was a journalist, and he's written a biography of Mayawati. It's called Behenji. That's again a well-written biography. I'm reading a biography of Sundaraiah right now. He is a very big, he's the first General Secretary of CPM, and he's a very, very influential figure in the Telangana movement here, and that's interesting. But also, like, there's a book, Ants Among Elephants by Sujata Gidla. There's another interesting take. It's on it's another interesting take on the Telangana situation, written from a Dalit communist perspective. So these books, of course, these are non-fiction, but both, I think they all, at like from 18 to 25, fiction was really big, and it had a big influence.
Thank you, Madhavi, for talking to me.
Thank you so much for talking to me.
As always, it was interesting, actually, and I wanted people to hear as well. So, thank you.
Thank you for watching this episode. I hope you liked it. I have a request. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel, Pinarai Kari, and don't forget to click the bell icon so that you get notifications for my future videos. So I'll be back next week with another episode. Till then, bye. Lal Salam.